темную ночь.
Hello, thank you for joining me at Bert's Books, where today we are going to be examining two very different fictional treatments on the same subject, or more specifically the same campaign, that being Operation Taifun, a prong of the German invasion of Russia in 1941, which was more broadly known as Operation Barbarossa, a famously overconfident undertaking that ran out of juice virtually at the gates of Moscow itself, at which point it became starkly evident that the German High Command had bitten off far more than they could chew. Now, naturally, the historical significance of this campaign, which shaped the map of Europe for many years since, plus the extreme natures of the political systems involved and the level of destruction that resulted from that, along with the sheer enormity of the military undertaking, all of this has provided post-war novelists with fertile ground. And we're going to be examining two very different treatments of the events leading up to the failure of the German offensive on the defence line of Moscow in December of 1941. Now, the first title we're going to be looking at is simply called Moscow, first published 1952 by Theodor Plievier. Plevier's credentials in this area are rather more quantifiable than Sven Hassel's. Plevier was born in Berlin in 1892, and after a spell as a merchant sailor was co-opted into the Imperial Naval Service during the First World War, an experience that was channeled into his earlier novels that included The Kaiser's Coolies of 1930, and which seems to have shaped his politics to the extent that he became involved in the 1918 Wilhelmshaven mutiny. And between the wars he was part of an artistic and somewhat anarchistic commune. Naturally, Germany became unsafe territory for Plevier with the rise of National Socialism. His books were on the list of combustibles, and you may know the saying about what happens next once you start burning books. Fleeing the country, he settles in the Soviet Union, where he continues his activities as a writer. On the outbreak of the Second World War, as a German speaker, Plevier was granted access to German prisoners of war. Based on the interviews he conducted, he completed the first of his World War II themed novels in 1945, which was Stalingrad. Given the time and place, along with the fact that this work had the Soviet seal of approval on it, doubtless some censorship along with that, Stalingrad kind of qualifies as state propaganda, perhaps. But even so, it was an international success, being adapted for both German and British TV, the latter production starring, believe it or not, Peter Vaughan, later of Citizen Smith and Porridge fame. By 1948, Plevier had become sufficiently disenchanted with the Soviet Union to break away into the British zone of occupation and to work on this, his second volume of his World War II trilogy. Like Stalingrad and finally Berlin, Moscow adopts multiple viewpoints of a cast of characters, certain of whom are constant throughout the trilogy. Moscow opens with an extensive military inventory that it quickly transpires dates from centuries previous. Lieutenant General von Bommelberg's staff have procured this item from an archive in Lodz and have presented him with this symbolic document on the eve of the launch of this gargantuan operation, for which an assembled leviathan of German divisions are poised to punch into the Eastern Territory, which is in fact more of Poland, at least at this stage of proceedings. Plevier's technique of dancing viewpoints leads us down through the ranks via liaison officers Holmers and Langhoff, who are pondering the implications of special orders. This war certainly won't be according to the rules. Their staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel Wilshofen, former villager SA comrades and now NCOs, Riederheim, Vierpfeil and Gnurtke, all of whom are contemplating the enormity and scale of the task ahead of them. The balloon goes up with a maximum of sound and fury and a minimum of organised resistance on the Soviets' part. The well-coordinated Wehrmacht steamrollers eastwards in what's described as a fluid advance, catching the Red Army on the back foot. Soviet formations are either crushed outright or cut off into isolated pockets. "This is going to be a lovely campaign," comments an anti-tank gunner to Gnertka. "All that cardboard stuff the Russians have." Gnertka doesn't share his enthusiasm. There are already small signs that this isn't necessarily going to be a walk in the park. Lieutenant Emmanuel, who'd suffered shell shock back in the French campaign, is undergoing a visible relapse. A friendly fire incident has already decimated some anti-tank crews, and gunfire is emanating from positions that have already been reported as taken. From these early ill omens on the German side, we're transported to the Soviet viewpoint. Lieutenant Rievsky and Sergeant Subikov, part of a scantily supplied Russian unit, have been cut off in a wooded area during the initial advance, have taken at sniping at German troops who've jumped off their convoy for a quick roadside shit, before throwing it all in with a foolhardy death or glory gesture against a vastly superior force. The suicidal attitude that these badly equipped Soviet troopers demonstrate is beyond the Germans' comprehension. How can people sacrifice themselves like that? Against the odds though, Subikov has only been concussed and he lives through this encounter. His subsequent travels cause him to cross paths with Schulger, an old-timer whose memories go back to before the revolution. Schulger treats the younger man to an impromptu history lesson in which the current leadership is roundly castigated, and this theme proves to be a significant preoccupation for Plevier throughout much of this narrative. The author does maintain the balance of viewpoints between the Russian and German sides. On the latter part, we witness deleterious effects of diminishing morale, the endless horizons of enemy territory, the stretched supply lines, and the realities of a war that's very different from the relative pushovers of the previous German campaigns. Through Wilshofen's eyes, he's transferred from staff to an armoured formation. We see the panzer troops' horrified realisation that the supposedly backward Russians, in fact, have tanks that are vastly superior to the Germans' own. One of those defining, unpleasant surprises which had far-reaching implications for the outcome of this campaign. However, this book becomes increasingly concerned with a scathing view of the ineptitude of the Soviet system during the initial phase of this conflict. Part of this comes from the viewpoint of Colonel Semyonov, who witnesses a great deal of the chaos firsthand. Stalin's paranoid police state operations having effectively hamstrung Soviet military efficacy. We're given some insight into the nature of this system with the goings-on at Construction Point 057, a monolithic undertaking that's part of the Moscow-Minsk highway project that runs on convict labour and is described as carrying on with immense expense of manpower and correspondingly high wastage of human life. Project 057 now lies in the path of the German advance, and in the panic the responsibility of its demolition, the scorched earth policy, is passed down the ranks to a 22-year-old lieutenant. Discipline among the convicts immediately begins to deteriorate and a murderous prison rebellion looms. This is narrowly avoided when the first demolition charges spatter provisions from the supply dump randomly throughout the complex, and the semi-starved inmates binge on this unexpected windfall. Amid frantic defensive efforts, there's an overall exodus back towards Moscow, where crisis point for the Soviet leadership is approaching. Forward units such as Wilshofen's are pressing on against the capital, hampered by the autumn rains and the increasing stretch on supply lines. However, for all the optimistic talk of a parade in Red Square, the final decisive German push never comes. At 5 minutes to midnight, and pretty late in the narrative too, with the leadership poised to evacuate Moscow, the Soviets somehow managed to turn the situation around, aided both by the onset of a historically cold winter, something that the Germans had failed to factor into their calculations, and an influx of fresh Soviet divisions from their seemingly inexhaustible eastern territories. The outcome, as history tells us, was catastrophic for the Germans, and on the individual level of the characters described here, nobody comes through unscathed. And so to Hassel, whose Blitzfreeze was a relatively late entry into his series of war novels, by which time this highly successful pulp author had his formula well and truly down. Barring a couple of chapters of his first novel, Legion of the Damned, Blitzfreeze is chronologically the earliest historical setting for a Hassel story, many of which seem to be set in some unspecific time and location in the Russian campaign, while a set of characters characters here are pitched as early Hassel. Confusingly, some of the characters are presented as established members of the platoon, when they're introduced as newcomers in other novels at a much later stage of the war. It's tempting to think that Hassel may have found himself low on ideas at this point and landed on the 41 campaign as a chunk of the World War II timeline he hadn't yet exploited. We start off at a point in the late summer of 1941 in which Hassel and platoon are lying concealed in the long grass, poised to pick off a group of bivouacked Soviet tanks with their Panzerfausts. Technology that wasn't yet available. Who cares about details like that, however, when there is some prize voyeurism to be had? An oversexed Russian lieutenant is intent on seducing a female member of the battalion, and before we know it, they're giving the 5th Company of the 27th Regiment of Panzers the kind of floor show that they'd have paid good money for back on the Reeperbahn. Duty calls, however, once Lieutenant Oleg has tucked it back into his pants and got back to his BT-5, and once Hassel and his pals have wound down their customary banter, they spectacularly demonstrate what an effective anti-tank weapon the Panzerfaust would prove to be about 2 and a bit years later. The next we see of them, we're now into the rainy Russian autumn, and they're a panzer crew again. The fluidity of function is another characteristic of these Hassel books. Nominally they're a tank unit, but this seems to depend on the demands of whatever particular narrative Hassel has chosen to take. And we're given a fairly lively description of a panzer operation, which doesn't neglect to include a mention of that regular Hassel staple, the 3-axle vehicle, which for some reason is one of the author's recurring fixations. It's just as well we're not doing a drinking game with this one, along with a fairly graphic gore that's also one of his trademarks. Anyhow, it's an action-packed sequence, though ever prone to exaggeration. Hassel throws the kitchen sink of Soviet armaments into the flow before we get sidelined into one of Porter's endless officer-baiting anecdotes, which fills out the rest of the chapter rather pointlessly. That dealt with, we're back with the Panzers again. In Hassel's case, a Mark IV with, we're told, a long barrel 75mm gun. Again, I'm not sure that was a reality in 1941, but the focus this time is the plight of opposing anti-tank teams, including a 100mm German one that seems to be struggling to penetrate a T-34. A difficult nut to crack, if only they had an effective anti-tank tool to hand. Maybe a Panzerfaust. Again, the chapter is bulked up by more of Porter's tedious bullshit, before we get to the business of an encounter between German armour and massed T-34s, in which Hassel and company lose their tank, but squeak through. The next chapter begins with a dispute over rations that'll be very familiar to anyone who's ever read All Quiet on the Western Front, before yet more of Porter's anecdotal bollocks that's only cut short by a massive Russian counterattack. Further panzer action ensues before their tank is again disabled and they have to make a run from Russian infantry, a situation they get themselves out of rather comedically by bareback riding a herd of stampeding Russian cows to safety. Porter's mount, perhaps rather symbolically, bucking him off into a shit heap. From here on, the Russian winter comes down and the offensive begins to bog down in earnest, 140 kilometres from Moscow. A little levity is injected, however, with another of Hassel's fallbacks, the Porter and Tiny caper, as if they'd have had the time and energy for this kind of shit in sub-zero temperatures. On this occasion they scam a meat depot into believing that they're undercover inspectors and blag an extravagant feast-stroke piss-up out of the credulous depot official. Hassel milks this for all the mileage he can before we're back on the road to Moscow, and the company are back into infantry mode for the crossing of the river Nara on the city's outer defences. Scenes of intensely bloody combat follow, in fact probably the most effective passage of this novel. Hassel kind of spoils this with the following chapter, which is another of his standbys, the very unlikely sounding commando mission. On this one, they are for some reason required to join with the Brandenburgers, who are the actual specialists in this sort of thing, and infiltrate Moscow itself in order to knock out a giant complex which is manufacturing T-34s. Soviet industry having famously undergone a massive eastward evacuation television programme that autumn, this seems rather dubious. This turn of events is gleefully announced to them by the gangsterish black marketeer Chief Mechanic Wolf, who's somehow privy to classified information before anybody else is. After the customary colourful exchange of insults with Wolf, the company are introduced to their guide for this jaunt, the Mongolian Vasily, who's another in a long line of truly dreadful ethnic characterisations that you'll find throughout Hassel's books. Anyhow, they naturally succeed in their task. They even have the time and inclination to play Peeping Tom on some lady soldiers at a Russian bathhouse. So now we're into December, and what follows, of course, is the massive Soviet counter-offensive and the collapse of the German front line. Vividly described here from multiple viewpoints, though again Hassel's capacity for sensationalism comes into play. While it's a war novel's task not to be coy about the ghastliness of the whole business, Hassel rather outdoes himself here, describing the demise of Fahnen Junker West, who lies out in no man's land for a couple of days with his lungs hanging out of his rib cage, expanding and contracting like giant balloons. Now, I'm no anatomist. It's been a long time since biology, but does the human body work that way? Now, up until this point in the book, we've never met Herr West. This is another vice of Hassel's. He throws characters into the storyline purely for the purpose of witnessing their extermination, like Star Trek security guards. Hassel and company find themselves cut off from their own front lines, sort of a familiar situation in this type of fiction, and they have to slog it back through many miles of hostile frozen territory in order to reach a stable Wehrmacht position. This becomes a sort of elimination game for those short-stay characters, and also a hazardous business for the peripherals, such as the Professor, a bookish studenty type who somehow got himself mixed up in all this, and who loses an arm on the last hurdle. Now, I'm pretty sure we encountered the Professor in another book pitched at a later stage of the war, in which there's no mention of this disability. Anyhow, Hassel and his pals somehow make it through, sustaining various injuries along the way, and a sacrificial lamb at the pinnacle of all this is their company commander, Lieutenant Moser. This is pretty standard in Hassel books. While the core company members always make it through, their officers tend to be pretty disposable and tend not to last for more than 1 or 2 books. The full stop to this tale, fittingly, is a gaseous emission from Porter's bowels. No manners, but what a critic. Now, there's not much argument here that we should be taking Hassel's works particularly seriously as far as documenting the German World War II experience, but you have to bear in mind that these books were pitched towards a pulp audience and had to play to the appetites that came with that, and they were undeniably successful at this. Hassel's book sales are counted in the millions. From the perspective of reading this book decades after my first encounter with it, its deficiencies are painfully evident. Difficult as it is to understand now, I did lap it up at the time I first read it. The copy I had at the time was an 80s imprint with this far superior cover art, which was this rather haunting image of this scarred and combat-shocked German Lanzer alone amidst this tundra-like landscape. Perhaps this image, along with the undeniably apt and succinct title, fulfilled the book's remit rather more successfully than the actual text really does. So I'd have to conclude that Plevier's work is by far the more serious treatment on this subject, a seriousness which really the subject does merit. The German award for service in this campaign became morbidly joked over as the Order of the Frozen Meat. But a caveat with that, Plevier's work isn't entirely pitched towards the action novel type of audience. Pacing of Moscow does demand a bit of perseverance. Plevier does have an axe to grind with the Stalin regime in this one, and it does dominate a significant middle chunk of the book. But a bit of patience does pay off with this one. The whole trilogy, including Stalingrad and Berlin, are all worthy of investigation.